Okay, it looks like we're right at 2:30 and ready to get started with our webinar this afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Betsy Hill, and president of the BrainWare company, and I want to welcome you to our webinar this afternoon hosted by the Brains and Learning channel. As we are getting started here today, just a couple of housekeeping items. First, we are recording today's webinar, and a link to the archived version of the webinar will be available. Usually it takes just about a day or so, and you should be getting notice of that. Also, we are very happy to provide a copy of today's slides, and those will be sent automatically to those who are attending today. If you are watching this as a recording and you would like a copy of the slides, you can contact us to request the slides, and that information will be included at the end of the webinar. Finally, please let us know if you would like to receive a certificate of participation for the webinar that you can use for professional development credit as appropriate. You can just type that request into the chat window, or you can email us later. Either one is fine. Also, please use the chat window to type in questions that come up for you as we're going through the presentation this afternoon. Okay. So this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, and I started really to get some insight into it when I served on the Board of Trustees of Chicago State University, 2 years as chairman of the board. Chicago State, for those who may not be familiar with it, is one of the state universities in Illinois. The student body is 95% African American, 70% or more non-traditional college students, and almost 100% will be the first college graduates in their family if they graduate. And that is always the question. You know, we seem to hear a lot of mixed messages today about the value of a college education. But for many employers, the credential has meaning. This is data from the job site Career Builder, and they did a survey of employers in which they found that 37% of employers are now requiring a college degree for jobs that used to only require high school graduation, and 27% are requiring master's degrees where a college degree would formerly have been enough for that particular job or role. They also found that employers are reluctant to promote those who don't have degrees. And so there really seems to be some more emphasis. The biggest impact is on what they refer to as middle skill jobs, which I generally relate to middle class wages. So the bar for the middle class careers seems like it's getting higher than it ever has been. And why are employers raising their requirements? Because they see benefits. And in terms of everything from the quality of work to innovation to retention of employees to customer loyalty, and of course, even interestingly, just a little over 20% mentioned improvements in revenue as something that they expect to see and have seen from raising the requirements and requiring more college degrees. And shouldn't be a surprise, makes a lot of sense that also the rate of high school graduates going on to college has gone up, and today is just about as high as it has ever been, over 60%. So that would make sense. If employers are looking for college graduates, then people are going to try to get a college degree to be able to fulfill those requirements. So far, our traditional ideas of supply and demand sort of seem to be working. But there is a significant disconnect, and that disconnect has to do with the readiness of those high school graduates to take on college-level work. Only about a quarter of college graduates taking the ACT are college-ready in all 4 subject areas, and almost a third are not ready in any of the subject areas. So what happens to all these students who get to college but aren't prepared for it? We might speculate that there would be a high need for remediation to bring students up to college level when they arrive on campus. Because after all, colleges want to fill up those seats in their classrooms and in their classes. And that is actually, of course, what we find, and this is probably, given those of you who are on the webinar today, probably already know a lot about this, may even be experiencing it in your own institutions. But over 50% of students nationwide who enter community colleges have to take remedial courses. And for low-income students, that increases to almost 2/3. Even for four-year colleges, remedial classes are far from rare. So the next question becomes how these students are faring once they've completed the remedial classes that they take. And here the news is not very good. While students are largely able to get through those remedial classes, it's not enough to get them on track to graduate. And there, as you can see here, only about 10% of the students who go through remediation in two-year colleges, and just a little bit over 1/3 in four-year colleges actually graduate. And I believe that the statistic here is within 8 years, so it's a considerable amount of time in which they're not actually able to get through and get their degrees. There's been a lot written on this topic, and there are undoubtedly many reasons for lack of persistence. Programs that don't get them quickly enough into college work, lack of money, not necessarily for tuition, but for living. I recall that when Chicago State instituted an early warning system, we uncovered situations like a student who wasn't attending class because they didn't have money for the book. And of course, there were ways around it, but often these populations don't have the resources, don't have the mentoring, don't have the ability to really go out and find other ways to get around things. And of course, many institutions are providing alternatives now. I should note that I'm no longer on the Chicago State Board, for which I am very grateful, because up until yesterday, actually, the lack of a state budget in Illinois meant that CSU was going to have to close its doors at the end of the school year and be unable to reopen because it has received no state funds since last June. A bit of a reprieve came. It's not enough probably for the whole next school year, but we're watching that, of course, with great interest here in Illinois, and a lot of trepidation for those students who aren't sure what their college careers are going to hold for them. But I want to come at the question of the lack of preparation and the lack of college readiness from a perspective that's just a little bit different from some of what we usually see. So if we look at the, let me switch my slide. We talked before about how many students, at least based on their ACT scores, are underprepared for college. They're not sufficiently prepared in English, math, reading, and science. And that's important because they will surely need to build on these subjects for successfully coping with college-level work. But if we look at the skills that people commonly say college students need, the list actually doesn't include English, math, reading, and science. It looks quite different. So what this is some of the ample amount of advice that is available on the internet for college-bound students and their parents. None of the lists actually mention reading or math or science. Most mention aspects of self-management and thinking, things like note-taking, questioning, inference, planning, tolerance for ambiguity, critical thinking. And there are a couple different ways that I find people usually think about this. One is to say that a certain level of academic performance is required for college-level work, but all these other skills are also necessary. So we need math and science and reading, but we also need to have these other skills. And if that's the case, then it may be that even those students who are academically prepared, and I would put academically prepared in quotes for reasons that I hope will become clear later, they may not be socially, emotionally, and in other aspects of cognitive development prepared for college. But generally, we don't know how to measure or assess social, emotional, and non-subject matter related aspects of cognitive development things like attention or planning and visualization, which you will also notice on this list. So we hope for the best generally and provide students and their parents with a list and say, you need to have these things. Sometimes, as in this quote from the DC Department of Education's website, the need for skills beyond reading and writing and math is actually acknowledged. So here we see is in the highlighted red, reading, writing, math, social, and cognitive skills, which are necessary to be qualified for and succeed in the post-secondary academic program that the student wishes to pursue. But that prompts more questions. So these are the important questions that we're going to be talking about this afternoon. Why is remediation at the college level so much usually like the instruction students received in elementary and high school? When do all those other skills get developed? And how do those other skills develop? So this is a model that we use to look at the relationships among these skills. Like all models, it oversimplifies things, but hopefully it will help us make the point. Up at the top of the pyramid are the reasons for all of this concern about education, about being prepared for college. Most educators are in the business to help others attain their academic goals, have a satisfying career that lets them support their families, and enables them to stay out of jail and be healthy. So if everybody could achieve all those things in life, we would certainly feel pretty good about that. Oops, I think I did 2 slides there. Okay. In higher education, we focus on programs, subjects, disciplines that will support further academic and career endeavors. So what I've added here underneath those lifetime outcomes are some of the most popular majors in colleges today. And apparently this list has not changed very much over the years. Things like business administration, psychology, nursing, biology, teacher education, English, criminal justice, and history. But all kinds of academic programs and majors could fall in here, whatever it is that we're offering at the higher education level. Oops, my slides are going too fast there. All right, come on, just one at a time. There we go. Underpinning the academic requirements of college-level work are, of course, the traditional measures of college readiness, reading and writing, math, and science. But obviously, there was more to my pyramid. The rest of the pyramid represents all of the cognitive infrastructure needed to learn to read, to do math, at increasing levels of complexity, and everything that builds on that, including higher education and workplace performance ultimately and how we do in our lives. The box at the very bottom contains basic mental processes, often referred to as cognitive skills. And these are some of the most basic processes that our brains engage in. Things like attention, visual processing, sequential processing, auditory processing. Remember that attention was even called out as one of those must-have skills for college students, but in many ways it is one of the most basic processes that our brains engage in. The next 2 boxes on top of that foundational skills box refer to cognitive skills that are now often being called executive functions. So executive functions generally are the directive capacities of our minds. Notice that everything in the higher order executive function box was on that list of skills that are necessary for college students. The fact that the next box doesn't necessarily show up on the list is simply a matter that they are there, but implicitly rather than explicitly. The same way that the skills in the bottom box are there implicitly and sometimes explicitly in the case of attention. Other than attention, they're not specifically called out, but they are inherent and implicit in all of the other skills that are called out. It's only in the last decade or so that neuroscience research has begun to show clearly what the role of these mental processes is, to name and characterize them and to show how important they are. So I'm going to clear that up. So I want to start with a clean slide and make one more point. If all of these underlying cognitive processes are working well, then all is well, and students will learn to read and do math and everything else that builds on that foundation. If not, and we all have cognitive strengths and weaknesses, and we all can probably think of friends, family members, and colleagues whose attentional skills or directionality or cognitive flexibility are not as strong as they could be, and actually may be a challenge for them when they're trying to take on college-level work. Learning is going to be much more of a challenge if that is the case. The problem is that we are teaching above the level of cognitive infrastructure in K-12 education and at the post-secondary level. We never teach cognitive infrastructure. We never ensure that our students have that. We assume that they bring it with them, and that's not always a very good assumption. One of the main reasons we don't teach these skills, I think, is that they happen mostly at a non-conscious level. Therefore, they really aren't amenable to direct instruction. So, for example, you can't explain to another person how to sustain attention, or see more at a glance, or hold more information in memory. However, those skills are obviously necessary and part and parcel of all those essential skills that we saw on that list that college students need to have. So what I want to do now is to spend a little more time on memory, and particularly the role of working memory. Working memory was one of the 3 core executive functions: working memory, inhibitory control, and cognitive flexibility. Inhibitory control is pretty much self-explanatory. It refers to our ability to stop ourselves from doing something we would otherwise do. You can think of it as that instantaneous inhibitory control when you decide or keep yourself from punching someone when you get mad at them. But you can also think about it as something that you practice over a period of time. So, for example, deferring gratification, as we know we have to do in college to be successful, is another example of inhibitory control. Cognitive flexibility, we were referring to that just a minute ago, when you are able to shift your mind, when you learn something new, when your existing model of how something in the world is working is changed, as it often does when we get to college, because other models have been too simple, and we need to learn more complex models and really to change our minds. We move from an Aristotelian view of physics to a more Newtonian view of physics, and that requires quite a mind shift, and that's an example of cognitive flexibility. But I want to focus on working memory because it does correlate so highly with academic performance. So here is a simple model of memory. Information comes into our brains through our senses: sight, sound, smell, taste, touch. The relevant information, and we only actually can process something like 10% of the information we take in. The rest is just discarded. So that whatever is relevant, whatever our brains decide that we're going to focus on, gets to be processed at a conscious level, and that happens in working memory. Working memory is the only conscious processing available to us. And information can also be discarded, of course, at that point, and it will be, unless it is processed enough. And rehearsal, that is spending time with it, thinking about it, is one way to characterize this. If we get sufficient rehearsal, sufficient practice, sufficient time on task, sufficient time on the topic in working memory, and think about it, then we have a chance to get it into long-term memory so that we can retrieve it later. So working memory comes into play when the brain has decided to pay conscious attention to something. Most neuroscientists agree that this activity happens in our frontal lobes, the very front part of our brain, just behind our forehead. And what it really is the process of reactivating information throughout the cortex that is needed to carry out a particular task. So sometimes it's convenient to think about working memory as a work table, as a space on your desk or your kitchen table, if you can imagine that, where you are assembling everything you need to work on a particular project. In our minds, it might be the information we need to solve a problem or to create a new idea. Sometimes think of it, it's easier to think about it as being assembling everything just the way, for example, that you would go get ingredients from your kitchen cupboard in order to make a recipe, and that you would assemble those and put them out on the table so that they're ready to make your cake or whatever it is you're planning to put. But that's not really exactly what happens in our brains when we retrieve the information that we need to work on. It's really about activating all of those neural networks across our brain that contain the information that we need so that we can think about them consciously. So it requires us to keep a lot of things active in our minds at the same time. So what I want to do now is to take a little example of working memory. I always think it's really helpful to make sure everybody has a little bit of experience with this so that they can understand exactly what we're talking about. So we're going to look at an example, and when you see the next slide, you're going to see a string of numbers, and your job is to remember them. So here we go. Oops, sorry. Left them up there. Okay. So think to yourself. You don't have to say this out loud. What were the numbers? Do you remember them? If you said 7, 4, 3, 8, 5, 9, 2, you were correct. Good job. Now let's try a harder one. Oops, boy, I'm just so sensitive here. There we go. Okay. Do you remember those numbers? Don't feel bad if you don't. Most adults have a working memory that can manage 7 numbers plus or minus 2. So, and that list on the last page, on the last slide, was 10 numbers. So it's a list that can't easily be remembered by most of us. If you did, you were probably using a technique called chunking, which is you were grouping things and remembering things in chunks of information. But you were still, the typical adult span of working memory is about 7 digits or 7 chunks of information. Working memory is, and working memory capacity is developmental. So we start off being just able to remember a couple of things when we're young, and over time we get so that we can remember more and more things. But that doesn't mean that every adult has the same working memory, and working memory can be developed. But if you're working with only 3 or 4 chunks of information, that's going to be a limiting factor in your ability to do many, many things. That's not a very interesting slide to look at, is it? Okay. In fact, if we go back to our original list of the skills college students should have, we can make a good argument that working memory is involved in a number of these. Certainly in note-taking, we need to keep a bunch of information. We need to be able to listen as well as write things down as the instructor is talking. Problem solving requires us to get a lot of information. Test preparation, and absolutely when you're taking a test, a lot of demands on working memory in many cases. Critical thinking, innovation and creative thinking, planning. So all of these have significant components of working memory. So while we didn't call it out as working memory in the list, because if they did, students and parents would go, I don't know what that is. How do I go get one? But nonetheless, it's really implicit in everything in the list and all of these important skills. The story goes even deeper, though, and so what I want to talk about next is the role and relationship of some of those cognitive processes, that cognitive infrastructure in that pyramid on that earlier slide, to what we think of as the basics and the foundation that students need to have when they come to college from an academic point of view. So, for example, if you ask most educators, if I ask most educators what the basics of reading are, I will typically hear something like decoding and fluency and comprehension. And these are, in fact, essential skills. We can't be good readers without them. But they're not the most basic. They're decoding, for example, there's no decoding part of our brain. In order to decode, we have to use a lot of different mental processes, and they all have to be working well and working together in order for us to do that. So if our ability to sustain our attention is not good, if my mind goes wandering off fractions of a second into decoding a word, that's going to be problematic. If I can't visually discriminate quickly between a B and a P or an M and an N in thousandths of a second, again, that's going to impair my decoding. Sequential processing, an example of that is keeping the letters in the right order or the words in the right order as they come in through my senses into my brain. The same principle applies with fluency. So when we want to build up speed, how much information we can take it at a glance, which is what visual span is, processing speed, my flexible attention, all of these are going to have a bearing on my ability to build up fluency and how fast I can actually do that. Not just how fast I can read, but how fast I can build up my speed in reading. And then ultimately, of course, we read to understand and to learn. And comprehension is where rubber really meets the road, and where many teachers at all levels, I would say, worry that their students are reading but not necessarily comprehending what they're reading. And here is where some of those both basic cognitive processes, but as well those executive functions, particularly working memory, are vital. So if you think about what happens when you read, you're getting information in, you're holding on to 2 or 3 pieces of information that you've read in the first couple of sentences, ideas, relationships, and you're holding that in mind while you're trying to absorb more information and plug that in and see those relationships. That all happens in working memory. If you encounter a concept you don't understand or a word you don't understand, and that happens a lot, of course, in college when we encounter new discipline-specific vocabulary and ideas, we have to pause. We have to maybe try to interpret from context what it is that we just read. We might have to ask someone, and then we have to bring that new meaning back and plug that back into what we were already reading about, hopefully not starting all over again. And that, again, is working memory. When we're actively, consciously thinking about what we're reading about and relating it to what we already know, which is really the definition of making meaning and learning, that happens in working memory as well. So that's why we need to think about this, because it's not just a side-by-side and nice to have in addition to, it's actually part and parcel of our ability to learn what we even consider some of these most basic academic processes. And the same is true of math. Spatial representations, we can think about our spatial understanding, our ability to understand directionality. All of this would relate to things like extracting information from charts and graphs, understanding geometry, understanding any kind of technical and visual spatial drawings, chemistry. We think about isomers in chemistry versus the same molecule just rotated and all those kinds of things. Information manipulation, solving any kind of problem is basically this. I used to call these story problems, but today everything in math is really a story problem because it's all supposed to be about application and real understanding. And then finally, ultimately, of course, math is very logical, and so our ability to use logic, to reason, to plan how to attack a problem, all those things are going to be important. So what do we do if students haven't developed their cognitive capacity to the level needed for college-level work? And I'm going to ask another question first, because it's a little bit easier to imagine. Our minds develop over time in interaction with our environment. And so while there is a time-based developmental component, and we tend as human beings to develop, and we will, a group of fourth graders, for example, will on average be as well developed cognitively as fourth graders. However, if you have a fourth grader who is not as cognitively well developed, maybe only to the level of an average second grader, then how is that student going to function and be able to be successful in a fourth grade classroom? They're simply not, prepared for that kind of work. And that's not uncommon, especially for economically disadvantaged students. We did a webinar late last year on the cognitive impact of poverty, and there is a significant impact there. There is a lot of research that's now showing that. The good news is that's not the end of the story, that we can actually develop these skills. But the question of what happens to students when they get to college really is no different from that. The good news, as I said, is that cognitive capacity can be developed, and in a relatively short period of time, with an effective cognitive training intervention. So I'm going to share some results, a little bit of research with you in the next few slides. And this first one is work that was done with students with specific learning disabilities. And these were younger, these were elementary age students rather than college age. But I want to share with you because I think this really points out the kinds of changes in some of those specific areas of cognitive processing that we know are going to be part of this. This was based on a cognitive training program called BrainWare Safari that has been used with a wide variety of individuals. And this was research performed as part of Dr. Sarah Avson's doctoral dissertation. So she worked with students with specific learning disabilities and divided them into a control group and a study group. And essentially what happens here, this is a little bit small, but the three areas that were measured were their general intellectual ability, so that's that cognitive infrastructure that I've been referring to, and reading and math, and how these are all fitting together. Now, these students, by definition, had cognitive issues because of their specific learning disabilities. I mean, basically that's redundant, it's saying the same thing. And you can see that while 90% is what is expected of a normally developing student on this particular test, which was the Woodcock-Johnson Cognitive Battery, these students were performing just a little bit above 60% proficiency, so a pretty big gap. Now, we know that you don't have to be designated as SLD to have cognitive processing issues. It's a spectrum, not a bright line. So we have many students who are in our classes and in at every level who can improve their cognitive functioning. Over the course of the 12 weeks, the students who were receiving their normal interventions but not a cognitive training program didn't really improve their cognitive functioning, and that's not a surprise. But the group that received the BrainWare Safari cognitive training program improved their cognitive ability on average to 89% proficiency, so virtually closing the gap to what would be considered normally developing. You can see the kind of impact that that had on reading and math. It was an improvement of 0.8 of a grade equivalent in reading and a full grade equivalent in math in just 12 weeks. What the next slide does is break that down into some of the sub-processing areas. And here's where we can connect it most directly back to that pyramid that we were looking at. So you can see how low these students were in working memory, verbal working memory, in short-term memory, in broad attention, and even in executive functions as a category. But we're getting them, based on this intervention, very close to, sometimes even surpassing, the level that would be considered normally developing. Now what I want to do is take a look at some results that deal more with students who are college age, and also that were part of a workforce training initiative, which again can be very much that similar age group, but the impact of training in a workforce environment. In both of these studies, the pre and the post test was the GAMMA, the General Abilities Measure for Adults. It's a computer-based time test, non-verbal, so that it eliminates the bias, cultural and language bias that might otherwise be present in some kinds of intelligence tests. And it has 4 subtests, and then you get an overall calculated score and basically an IQ measure. And so just to give you a little bit of a sense for what this test is like, here are examples of 2 of the subtests. The first one is called matching, where you look at that first image and then you have to quickly be able to identify the one following it, that it is exactly the same. Analogies, where most of us are familiar with word analogies. These are pictorial or image analogies, and you have to figure out the relationships between them. The other 2 subtests are sequences, where you see things moving through time and space and have to figure out what this state would be for the objects that are moving around at whatever point that is. And then construction, which is taking 2 figures and having to rotate and move them around to get them into a particular configuration. So the pilot that I want to tell you a little bit about was conducted at Ivy Tech Community College, the Muncie campus, this past fall, so this is quite recent. And Ivy Tech, for those of you who don't know, is the community college system in the state of Indiana. And what they decided to do was to pilot cognitive training with BrainWare as part of a student success course. That's a course that's required of all degree-seeking candidates, but many of the students at Ivy Tech, as well as in other institutions, of course, 2-year institutions, 4-year institutions, frankly, as well, but mostly 2-year, are in a position of needing to take remedial courses, and many in this group were. There were 3 of the students who were in the course that took the pre-test and the post-test, were there for both of them, and who also had a sufficient amount of usage of the program to suggest a possible impact on their cognitive functioning. And so I just want to share their stories with you. This is a 41-year-old female student, African American, with 7 children. So this is obviously the great example of a non-traditional student that we're seeing that's becoming more common and maybe more traditional in our colleges and universities. And she did very well, diligently followed the recommended protocol for using the program over the course of the semester, and finished all but 168 levels in the program, finished 151 of them. So got quite far in the program. But it was not easy for her. She was very challenged by it, even at some of the very early levels of the program. But she persisted, and she got through it, and it had quite an impact on her. She experienced an IQ gain of 6 points, moving from the 45th to the 61st percentile. And while it stayed in the average range, there was one area that it had a really significant impact on her ability to perform on this test. The matching area, which involves very quick identification of visual information, And it actually corresponds to an area that she was very challenged by in the cognitive training program, but moving from the average, not just to the above average, but all the way up to the superior category. So really significant change in that particular subtest area. Another student, also a female, but 19 years old with a toddler, and of course we know there are many of those, also struggled with the program. She did not get nearly as far as the first woman that we spoke about. And a lot of that may have to do with the fact that she tested quite low on her original pretest on the gamma. She was also challenged in some of those same areas, but particularly in visual working memory within the program. And in fact, her IQ, measured IQ on the pretest was 80. Now, this is a student who had expressed interest in criminal justice or possibly nursing, and those are areas where the ability to cope with college-level work, if you knew that someone had an IQ at that level, which is the 9th percentile, you might not recommend those kinds of courses of study. But 12 weeks later was a dramatic change for her. She improved her IQ 21 points so that she is squarely in the middle of the IQ range following her cognitive training program, and moved from the low average to the high average in a couple of categories. So very significant impact on her and her likely success performing college-level work. And the last one is different from the other two. Our college populations are now as diverse. A 27-year-old male completed all but 2 levels of the training program, so really did extremely well. Was not greatly challenged by it until he got to the most advanced levels. Interestingly, he performed in the high average range, the high end of the average range, but improved his IQ by 12 points to a point where this is someone who is now in a higher than average. It's in that high average range at the 90th percentile. And so significant and great things can be expected of this individual, who might not have been identified otherwise. I want to just suggest a little bit of what some of the students experienced, their comments, having used the program, having been through cognitive training. They talked about improved memory, improved focus. Remember that skill that we say everybody needs in college to be able to focus and to concentrate. Listening skills, essential for note-taking and understanding what the instructor is talking about. Motivation and persistence, dealing with frustration, sustained attention, critical thinking as a result, and greater confidence in all of these areas. Just want to mention one more study which dealt with a somewhat similar population, mostly high school graduates in this case. And in this case, however, they were not in a educational institution, but in a corporate training program. This was an oil refinery in California. These were individuals being hired to learn how to control the console in the oil refinery, which is like 747 control panels all put together, very complex. And in this case, they incorporated daily use of BrainWare cognitive training in their 6-week program. Again, we looked at the gamma test as a pre and a post, and also some of the other measures that would determine whether or not the trainees would get through the program and actually then be hired as permanent employees by the corporation. So what you're looking at here is several different measures. Group 1 and Group 2 both had cognitive training as part of their new hire training program in the oil refinery. The other group was the comparison cohort that had not had that. A couple of things to mention here. One is that 86% of the trainees improved their IQ on the gamma test. And typically, if you take an IQ test more than once in a fairly short period of time, you're going to get about the same score. Sometimes you might be a little bit higher, sometimes you might be a little bit lower. On average, if you give it to a lot of people, as many will be higher as lower. But in this case, 86%, almost all of them actually experienced an improvement in their IQ. We can also see the impact on many of the other measures that their future employment was dependent on. The cumulative on the left-hand side, you can see how much better the students, the new hires, trainees did on, this was the results of their weekly tests. The middle one is, which is very difficult to read, the label there, is their field work. So they went out in the field with a supervisor who assessed their performance, performed much better on that as well. And the final written exam, which was often very hard, and one of the things that students can, because you have to remember and accumulate all of that learning over the course of that period of time, is often where employees would fall out of the program. The typical rate of individuals getting through this program, if they had a cohort of 25, they would usually lose 1 or 2, sometimes even 3 of that cohort would not get successfully through the training program. And that was the case for that comparison cohort that is in that gray bar. For the 2 that did cognitive training, however, out of all of those employees, only 1 did not actually get through the training program. Everyone else was successful in completing the training at a level required for them to be hired by the corporation. So far we've talked about remediating or developing students' cognitive capacity, but I want to spend just a few minutes on another critical need that I see, and I'm going to call this remediating instruction. I found this, and I think this is pretty typical of the kind of thing that you can come across, ostensibly to help students develop their study skills. And it talks about a recommendation for college students being that to develop a very fine-tuned method of memorizing things, and underscores the role of overlearning, underscores the extra time that students should spend on trying to get information into long-term memory. And you can see my little do not parking sign up at the top. So while there is nothing technically wrong with this information, it is so incomplete in my view that it's likely to induce students to take a very inappropriate approach to learning material. So to understand that, I want to go back just briefly to our mental model, or our model of how the brain processes information. Remember, we said that rehearsal of information in working memory is essential to get it encoded and stored in long-term memory. So far, so good. But if we take a look at that long-term memory box, what we're going to see is that there are actually 2 different types of memory, of long-term memory, declarative and procedural. Declarative memory is our general knowledge, our life experiences that we can declare or recall or tell somebody. Procedural memory are the skills and habits that we have practiced to the point where they're automatic and unconscious. So these are both things that we remember over a long term, but they are very different in nature. Procedural memory is things we have practiced and practiced and done over and over and over again to the point where our brains just say, oh, I can take care of that. Sometimes we talk about autopilot. That would be characteristic of procedural memory. So things that we do like driving a car, tying our shoes, playing the piano, all those kinds of things we've just gotten good at and we no longer have to process consciously. Declarative memory, on the other hand, is information that we can declare or tell someone else. And there are 2 types. Semantic is our general knowledge, the vocabulary, words, people, places, concepts, facts that are independent of the context. And then episodic is our life experiences. So what I had for dinner last night, when my mother's birthday is, or what I gave her for her birthday, and we actually reconstruct these over time. And the reason that this is important is that these two types of memory and what we store in them requires very different kinds of rehearsal. So for things that are automatic, that are procedural memory, what we're going to do is we're going to want a deliberate conscious repetition of them. So that definition of memorization, just repeat it over and over and over again, is probably appropriate. And these would be appropriate for skills, motor skills, reading, playing an instrument, where lots and lots of practice is required. Most of us are pretty familiar with that. In fact, I'm willing to bet that we've all been asked to try to learn something through rote rehearsal when it would have been much more effective to learn it through elaborative rehearsal. And vocabulary words is one thing that comes to mind. So we're going to focus our next part of the discussion on what it means to get effective elaborative rehearsal. So here are some of the characteristics of elaborative rehearsal. This involves conscious processing in working memory to help information get stored in long-term memory. And as we talk briefly about these, try to think of a concrete classroom example of each, something you might do or a student might do on his or her own in order to do that. So first of all, they have to interact with the information to create a strong memory. The more that they rehearse it in different kinds of ways and think about it consciously, the better we're going to be able to do that. Multiple modalities are also important. If you present things in one way, for example, simply by telling students, then the only way they really have to retrieve it is by accessing that auditory impression. If we arrange for students to experience something with multiple senses and in different ways, they're going to have a lot of other ways to hook back in and reactivate that information. Making sure that we provide real-world examples is also important. Relevance is a strong motivator of attention. If students don't see the point of something, they just tune out. So real-life examples make the information more vivid, and of course then hopefully we get that emotional stamp on it from real life, and that will be a lot easier to recall when the test comes or when they need it in real life. And then finally, linking new information to what students already know is essential to create meaning. Otherwise, the information is just discarded shortly after the test or shortly after we don't have to do anything with it anymore. So as our webinar ends or nears our end, I want to bring us back to our model of the relationships among all these skills and really underscore the point that a strong cognitive infrastructure is critical for academic success, in fact, for everything we do in life. If we think we can provide remediation for college students that is the same as what they received in high school, we really need to think again. If it didn't work for them the first time, we shouldn't be surprised to get the same result the second time. We can, however, use our evolving understanding of the brain, how it learns, to be far more effective in helping students acquire the kinds of skills, both that are measured on the ACT, as well as the other cognitive skills and executive functions that we know they will need to be successful. Everything we do with our students physically changes their brains. We can take advantage of that extraordinary plasticity that is inherent in every brain, and including our own. So as you think about all this, it's not just about our students and their learning, it's also about our own brains and our own learning. So I think we have just a little bit we do have some time left. That's great. So here is my contact information. And I just want to open things up and see if we have any questions. Okay, so Deb Schulke asked a question about the increases in cognitive functioning from BrainWare, if they're lasting or temporary. And there are a couple different ways to answer that question, and as Roger is pointing out, the short answer is yes, that they do persist. We have done research where we have shown that they continue to increase, actually, at an accelerated rate, or they're sustained. And the reason that we do that is I want to go back a couple of slides just to underscore this point, which is we think about these skills, they are very much like procedural memory. They are procedural memory. So what we do is rehearse them over and over again until the point where they become automatic. And once they're automatic, we don't forget them. If you think about the kinds of things we talked about that we store in procedural memory, the kinds of skills that we practice like that, reading, walking, playing the piano, driving a car, tying our shoelaces, those are things that we don't really forget. We may not, if we don't do them for a long period of time, we may not be quite as proficient, but those things will come back. And that's basically the same, the concept that we would, and the reason that we would expect and actually see that those skills are sustained after training. Karen, I don't know if you've been monitoring the chat window to see if there are questions, but I'm going to be scrolling through as well.
No, you got the main question, and Amy had another comment about cognitive skills in teachers.
Right, the education world and understanding cognition. You know, and I started off as a high school teacher myself. I taught foreign language, and it was back in the dark ages, before all of this understanding of the brain and how it learns. If I had known a tenth of what I know now about the brain and how it learns, it would have been a very, very different experience for me, and it would have been a lot less frustrating, I can tell you. Because, you know, and I think that there are a variety of reasons, and maybe makes a good point. And one of them is that they are asked to teach, teachers are taught to instruct. They're taught to instruct reading and math and other subject matter. Things that you can explain to students where you provide context, you provide examples, you provide practice. But they haven't been taught and don't really see those underlying cognitive skills. And mostly those are things that they had to assume students brought with them to the classroom. They couldn't really do anything much about them, even if they felt that maybe their cognition was not as strong as it could be. And so it's something that has been neglected. It's implicit in all of those requirements. If you look back at that list of skills that we talked about as being so necessary for college students, it is very difficult to be successful if you can't take notes, if you can't critically think, if you can't plan, if you can't budget, if you can't do all of those kinds of things. College is really going to be a major challenge. But what we haven't completely appreciated as a profession of educators is that those are things that are part and parcel of those skills, and that actually can be trained, can be improved by a variety of different approaches. Some of them are about the kinds of cognitive training that we talked about today, but they're ways to develop critical thinking skills. I teach a strategic thinking course in an MBA program, and take a variety of different approaches to helping develop some of those different kinds of thinking skills. And Amy was reminding me that we call it psychology, which is very true. If there are any other questions, please feel free to type them into the chat window. If there are questions that occur to you afterwards and you would like to engage in further conversation, we love to talk about brains and how they learn and the impact that we can have on student success at any age and at any level. I hope you found this helpful today, and again, we will be circulating the link to the recording as well as copies of the slides. We'll be taking care. It'll probably take us a few days. I would say if you don't have your certificate of participation within a week or so, then please contact us, but hopefully we'll be getting it out to you pretty shortly. We so appreciate your being with us today and your time and involvement. We have another webinar coming up on May 24th, which is focusing on the role of cognitive skills for the workforce, and talk about how we develop 21st century skills in a workforce environment. Yes, please go ahead and share the link with other learning resource faculty, teachers, special ed teachers. We will be sending the link out, and feel free to share it as at will with anybody you think who might be interested in this topic and who really wants to figure out new ways to help their students. So again, thank you so much. I hope everybody has an absolutely wonderful rest of the day and the week, and we'll hope to see you again at another webinar sometime soon. Bye-bye.